Hey everyone, it's Katie and welcome to my first booktube video. Because of all my free time during quarantine, I was able to get back into reading, and I also started watching a lot of booktube videos again, which kind of inspired me to start this channel. So today I decided to tell you guys about all the books I've read since like the middle of May. I'm going to start with a couple series and then we'll just move on to like chronological order, kind of. So we'll see how this goes. Okay, so the first series I read was Caraval by Stephanie Garber. And so the first book is Caraval, and then Legendary, and the last book is Finale. So this series, it involves the sisters Scarlett and Tella, who live on this island Trisda with their cruel father, and he arranges a marriage for Scarlett because she's his oldest daughter. And the girls have always dreamed of attending Caraval, which is this performance that the audience gets to participate in, where they solve a bunch of clues that are given to them by Legend, who's the Caraval master. And this year, the girls actually are able to get tickets to play the game. So once they arrive there, Tella is taken because it turns out this year the game revolves around her, and to win the game, you have to be the first person to find Tella. So this book follows Scarlett on her journey to find her sister, win the game. It's really just about her journey through the games. So the first book is told from Scarlett's perspective, Legendary is told from a different character's perspective, and Finale is told from dual perspectives of Scarlett and that other character. So I think that's a really cool element to the series. I ended up giving this whole series 5 stars because I fell in love with this world. I just was so captivated by every aspect of the series. There were so many plot twists that I couldn't believe happened. And I really loved the thin veil between fantasy and reality. I was just as captivated and confused as Scarlett through this whole novel, which means that there was really great writing. I also really liked the romance throughout this series, but I loved that familial love was such a big part of it. The bond between the sisters was amazing to read. And yeah, I'm basically just obsessed with this whole world, and I'm excited to see what else Stephanie Garber puts out, and I really hope that she continues the world of Caraval in literally anything else. I would read it. I love it so much. Okay, so that brings us to our next series, which is the Infernal Devices by Cassandra Clare. These are a little hard to hold. First we have Clockwork Angel, Clockwork Prince, and then Clockwork Princess. And these books take place in England in the late 1800s. And it's similar to the Mortal Instruments series, if you've read that, because it also takes place in the Shadow World. So it follows Tessa, who travels to England to meet up with her brother, but she finds herself in the downworld with vampires and warlocks and other supernatural beings. And she realizes that she's being hunted, and she's not sure why, and she has nowhere else to turn other than to seek refuge in the Shadowhunter Institute. And once she gets to the Institute, this is where she finds herself in the middle of a love triangle with Will and Jem, who are best friends. So this whole series kind of follows Tessa while she's acclimating to the Shadow World, and you get to see her like navigate through her potential relationships and also see why she's being hunted, because she has no idea. And I gave this series I gave Clockwork Angel 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I gave the other 2 books in the series 5 stars because this whole series just made me feel so many emotions. I don't even know how to describe the emotional roller coaster it took me on. All of the characters were so well written. I had so many that I loved and I was rooting for, and a couple that I really didn't like, but that just proves how great Cassandra Clare's writing is, that she could make me dislike a character so much. I loved how many action-packed scenes there were, and they were in such great detail. Like, I feel like I could really picture what was happening. The love triangle between Tessa, Will, and Jem was so well written, because usually I favor one guy over the other, but in this case, I really couldn't choose who I wanted Tessa to end up with. And literally at the end of the last book, I just had to sit in silence because I needed time to process all the emotions I was feeling and this roller coaster that I went on. So that just shows how great this series is, because no other books have really made me do that. So that's the end of all the series that I've read. So now we'll just start with May and go through all the other books I've read. So the first one is First Life by Gina Showalter. And this book takes place in a world where your real life doesn't begin until after you die. So it follows Ten, who is a girl who's been locked in the Prin Asylum for 13 months, and she's being tortured, and her parents won't let her out until she lets them choose where she'll be after she dies. So there are 2 choices. There's Troika and Myriad. Not sure if I'm saying those right, but hopefully I am. And both sides are complete rivals who will do anything to sway Ten to their side. So both Troika and Myriad send their top laborers to convince her to choose them, and she finds herself on the run, and she just wants to survive long enough to make her choice. I ended up giving this book only 3 out of 5 stars, which isn't a bad rating. It just, this was a book that really made me think, which isn't a bad thing. It was just a little harder to get into the world because it was so complex. I spent the first half of this book torn between the 2 sides, just like Ten was. But once I made my choice for where I would choose to go, I kind of got a little annoyed with how long it was taking her to choose. And there were some chunks of the book that I really struggled to get through, but I think the second half of this book was definitely more enjoyable than the first for me. And a cool aspect of this book is Ten's obsession with numbers, and throughout the book, you'll find her talking about numbers, and like there's interesting facts that follow, which I thought was really cool. Yeah, overall, the book was pretty heartbreaking at times, but it was also like frustrating and made me think. But because it also kind of struggled to hold my attention, that's why I really only gave it 3 stars. The next book I read was Zodiac by Romina Russell. And this book takes place in a galaxy where your zodiac sign determines where you live. And it follows Ro, who's a student from the House of Cancer. And she has an unusual way of reading the stars. But after a violent attack on Cancer's moons, she ends up being made the guardian of Cancer, which she's very surprised by, especially because nobody really liked her unorthodox ways of reading the stars. But once more houses start to experience these weather-related tragedies, she finds a weird pattern in the stars and decides to take it upon herself to warn the other houses before any more bad things happen. So this book kind of follows Ro on her journey to unite the 12 houses of the Zodiac and to prevent the destruction of the whole galaxy. I ended up giving this 4 stars on Goodreads. I initially picked it up because I've always been really interested in anything that has to do with the Zodiac, so it was a pretty easy choice to pick up this book for me. But it took me a while to really get into it, just because books that involve space and like strategic battles and things, they're not really my thing. Like, it doesn't really interest me, but I decided to keep giving it a chance because I thought it was a really cool concept. My favorite part by far was the way that all the different Zodiacs were showing different personality traits. Their governments were different, and they just had different ways of life, which I thought was really cool. So you could really kind of see the differences between all the houses. And I really thought that was the best part of the book. It was so well done, and I'd really like to see more of that. I thought it was really creative. So that was definitely why I still rated it pretty high, even though it took me a while to get into the whole space world, if that makes sense. Okay, so those were all the books that I read in May. So now we are moving on to June, where I read Not the Girl You Marry by Andy J. Christopher. And this book follows Jack and Hannah. Jack is a journalist who's been stuck writing these how-to articles for way longer than he wants. And because he wants to be able to write more meaningful articles and kind of whatever he wants, he ends up making a deal with his boss that after he writes one final piece about how to lose a girl, he can move on and write the kinds of articles he wants and move on from these fluffy pieces. So then he ends up bumping into Hannah, who's a successful event planner who is just focused on climbing the career ladder and securing the next promotion. But in order to do that, she needs to prove to her boss that she has a romantic side so that her boss will trust her to plan weddings, because her boss doesn't believe that she has a romantic part of her that would allow her to plan those well. So this story follows them bumping into each other, and they both kind of decide to use the other person without them knowing. So it just kind of follows their relationship and them trying to move up in their career, and I thought that was a really cool concept. I gave this book 3 out of 5 stars because as a future event planner, I was really excited to pick up this book. I was so happy to find something that involved event planning because it's something I always look for, but it didn't really meet my expectations. I'm not sure if it was the writing style or some of the word choices, but something just didn't really click with me the way I'd hoped. The banter between Hannah and Jack was really good, and it was enjoyable, and I loved that Hannah didn't really take anybody's crap. Like, she was very confident and stood up for herself, which I thought was really nice. But overall, there was just something about the writing that didn't really click with me, so that's why I couldn't give it more stars. But overall, it was a pretty good book. So that brings us to This Is What Happy Looks Like by Jennifer E. Smith. And this follows Graham after he accidentally sends Ellie an email about his pet pig. And from that point on, they just keep emailing each other and confiding in each other, and they kind of become friends over email. The only things they're keeping from each other is Graham's life in the spotlight, and Ellie has a secret hidden in her family tree that she doesn't really want anyone to find out. But because they get along so well, Graham takes the opportunity to head to Ellie's hometown and to meet her in person. So this kind of follows that journey and seeing how their relationship is different in person versus online, and you kind of get to see them find out those secrets about each other and how it affects their relationship. I only gave this book 2 stars on Goodreads. And it's not that I didn't enjoy the book, I just felt like there was really something missing, because I thought that Graham and Ellie's relationship was sweet, but it didn't really give me those butterflies I was looking for and that I found in other couples I've read about recently. And since their relationship was such a big part of this book, since there was something lacking, it was kind of hard for me to really love this story. Unlike other books I've read, when I had to put this down, it didn't really consume my thoughts. It wasn't calling for me to pick it back up. It never really had that grasp on me, which is something I always look for. Something I did really enjoy, though, is the familial aspect to this and the way it affected Ellie. So, yeah. The next book I read was Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard, and this book takes place in a world where your blood determines your status. So those with red blood, like Mare and her family, are meant to serve those with silver blood, because those with silver blood have these supernatural abilities that kind of elevate their status in the world. So our main character, Mare, she winds up at the palace, and in front of all these nobles, she finds out that she has an ability that she didn't know she had, even though her blood is red, which confuses a lot of people. So to hide this from society, the king forces her to pretend like she is a long-lost silver-blooded princess and betroths her to his youngest son, Maven. I gave this book 5 stars because it really played with my emotions, because there were so many plot twists, but I loved every second of it. Victoria Aveyard took a bunch of things I love and combined them into this one world. There's superpowers, royalty, war, romantic and familial love, and so much more that I really enjoy. It did take me a little bit to get into this book just because the world is so complex, but once I understood it, I was really invested, and it was really hard to put this book down. Next, we have The Weight of Feathers by Anna Marie McLemore. And this book kind of reminds me of a modern Romeo and Juliet, because it deals with these two families who are traveling performers, and they hate each other because of something that happened a really long time ago. And one of these families, they perform as swimming mermaids, while the other family, they're former tightrope walkers, and they perform in the trees. So Lace, she has been raised to believe that the other family practices black magic, and just simply touching them could end up killing her. So when disaster strikes, there's a boy from the other family who ends up saving her life, and it really turns her world upside down and makes her question everything she was taught to believe. I gave this book 4 stars. I thought it was like heartbreakingly beautiful and, for lack of a better term, magical. I thought it would just be about this magical forbidden romance, but it honestly is so much more than that. I really loved the intricate family relationships you get to see, especially because it's told from dual perspectives, so you really get a glimpse of both families' everyday lives, and you get to feel for both of the main characters and really try to find out the truth and find out which family wronged the other, just like both of our main characters are trying to do. The last book I read in June was Even If the Sky Falls by Mia Garcia. I am obsessed with this cover. It's just so beautiful. That was the first thing I noticed. But this one is about Julie, who heads to New Orleans on a mission trip because she's looking for a change and she just wants to escape from her life at home. But when she gets there, she realizes that she feels more trapped than ever before, so she decides to escape. And she throws on a costume and she immerses herself in the world of Mardi Gras. While she's there, she meets Miles, and they end up using fake names. They kind of ignore their complicated past, and he just spends the night giving her a tour of New Orleans. But at the last second, this incoming hurricane changes course and heads right for them, so it's not really possible for them to pretend that everything's fine. I gave this book 5 stars on Goodreads because it was just everything I wanted it to be and more. I've always been obsessed with the idea of visiting New Orleans, so I definitely jumped at the chance to experience it through this book. And the way Mia Garcia portrayed the city was so breathtaking and magical, and so is the relationship between Julie and Miles. I was a little worried because the book takes place over 24 hours, so I was worried that I would think the relationship was moving too fast, but that wasn't the case at all. I think it was so beautifully written, and I really did not want this story to end. I definitely would have given this 6 stars if I could. That's how much I loved it. So that is the end of June. So now we're moving on to July. which I started the month by reading The Statistical Probability of Love at First Sight by Jennifer E. Smith. And this book also takes place over a 24-hour period where the main character, Hadley, she misses her flight on the way to her dad's second wedding, and she ends up stuck at the airport where she meets Oliver. And they board their flight, they end up sitting in the same row, and they get to know each other during the long flight to England. But once they get to the airport, they lose track of each other, and they both start to wonder if fate will ever bring them together again. I rated this book 3.5 out of 5 stars. Again, I had worries that I thought this would seem really rushed because it was only over a day, but I think this was also very well done. Hadley and Oliver had great banter together, and I loved that they weren't super cheesy. Another element I loved was Hadley had a lot of personal growth as she navigated her father's second wedding, and the familial elements of the story, which, as you could tell through this video, I really enjoy. It was definitely a nice touch. But there were some parts of the book that consisted of flashbacks and thoughts that I kind of found myself skipping over because I wasn't as intrigued by them, so that's kind of why I took off a couple stars. The next book I read in July was Saint Anything by Sarah Dessen. And this book follows Sydney as she navigates dealing with an accident that sent her brother to jail and kind of threw her family into the spotlight. To help deal with it, she switches schools, and after her first day, she decides to go to this local pizzeria where she meets Layla, who decides to befriend her, and she also meets Layla's brother, Mac, and he makes her feel very safe and protected. So she kind of finds a safe haven in this pizza shop because of this family that comforts her. This book, I gave it 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. I think that Sydney has a really unique perspective, and I loved that as a reader I was able to take a peek into the coping process of dealing with a family member being sent to jail. I think the relationship between Sydney and Mac was very sweet, but there was also something lacking for me, which ultimately is why I only gave the book 4 out of 5 stars instead of 5. But that could have just been me. I think overall this was a really, really great book. The next book that I read in July is The Coldest Girl in Coldtown by Holly Black. This follows Tana, who lives in a world where vampires exist, and these vampires live in places called cold towns. But the thing is, once you set foot in a cold town, you can never leave. Just for everyone's safety, you just aren't allowed to ever leave. So one night when Tana wakes up at a party in a bathtub, and she leaves the room and finds that the only other people who survived were her ex-boyfriend Aiden, who is infected, and a mysterious boy with a secret. She's really shaken up, and she has to race against the clock to save all 3 of them by heading straight into a cold town itself. I really loved this book, and I gave it 5 stars because literally from the first page, I couldn't have put it down even if I wanted to. It was horrific and gruesome at parts, but it's also really exhilarating and heartwarming. My favorite character of this book is Gabriel, who's the mysterious boy from the party, because he was able to kick butt and he was scary at times, but he also had this soft spot for the main character, which I thought was really sweet. And this book had so many plot twists that sent my heart on a journey. Part of me is really glad that this is a standalone because there's a definitive end and it was so well written. But there's another part of me that's genuinely sad because I'd really like to see what happens to Tana and Gabriel after the last chapter. The next book I read was The Diabolic by S.J. Kincaid. I really hope I'm saying the last name right. But the main character in this book is Nemesis, who is a Diabolic. And Diabolics are these creatures who are created to kill anyone that tries to harm the person they are bonded to. So for Nemesis, that is a young girl named Sidonia. In order to protect Sidonia, Nemesis has to pretend to be her and travels to the Imperial Court in her place. Diabolics are told that they don't have any humanity, but that is the one thing that can save Sidonia and the Empire itself. I gave this book 3.5 out of 5 stars because the first half of this book was really slow for me and the world was kind of difficult to understand. But again, it could be because space books aren't really my thing, so this might just be something I struggle with in these kinds of books. But because I couldn't connect to the world, usually I connect with the main character, but since Nemesis and Diabolics themselves are seemingly emotionless, I also wasn't really able to connect with Nemesis for a good chunk of the book. As the book went on and Nemesis started to grow as a character, I really started to get into the book because I really do think it's a cool concept. So that brings me to my last book that I read in July, which is Love and Gelato by Jenna Evans Welch. And this follows Lena, who travels to Italy because it's her mother's last dying wish for her to get to know her father. And while she's there, somebody gives Lena one of her mother's journals that she put together during her time in Italy. So this journal really inspires Lena, along with her new friend Ren, to kind of follow in her mother's footsteps and go on similar adventures. Throughout their adventures, Lena discovers a secret that changes the way she views her mother, her father, and herself. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. This book is just charming. That's just the first word that comes to mind, is how charming this book is. I think the way that Jenna Evans Welch depicted Italy was absolutely breathtaking, and it made me want to travel there as soon as possible. And I loved that the adventures weren't just focused on all the tourist attractions you hear about, but you also really got to experience these unique things that only locals would know about. I adored the way that Lena's journey was kind of paralleled with the adventures that her mother was writing about in her journal, and I think the journal entries were a great addition. It was a great plot point, and it ended up raising a lot of questions, which added this mysterious element that I wasn't really expecting with such like an adorable book, but it really elevated the story for me, and this is just a great read. I'm definitely going to reread this book. So that brings us to August, and the first book I read in August was An Emperor in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir. In this book, those who defy the Empire are met with death, so Laia and her family don't ever challenge the Empire. But suddenly, her brother is arrested for treason, and she decides the only way to save her brother is to help the rebels by spying from within the Empire's greatest military academy, because in exchange for her doing that, the rebels will help her save her brother. So at this academy, Laia ends up meeting Elias, who is the Academy's finest soldier, but he is also their most unwilling, and they soon realize that their destinies are intertwined. This book definitely deserves 5 stars. I really loved the way this book was written, because typically I find myself skipping some descriptive passages, but with this book, I literally read every word. From the very beginning, there were themes of brutality and loyalty and guilt, and that grabbed my attention and kept me invested through the rest of the story. And our main characters are both very complex in their dealings with guilt, their yearning for freedom, and they both have these pasts that are just looming over their heads. And I really loved that this was told from dual perspectives, because that way we were able to kind of root for each of the main characters separately before seeing them come together and interact with each other. And I thought that was really cool. That brings me to Alex Approximately by Jen Bennett. This follows Bailey and Alex, who met online and started talking about movies, but they live on separate coasts until Bailey moves in with her dad in the same town as Alex. But because she has some doubts, she doesn't tell him that she moved to his hometown. Her dad has her get a job at this local museum where she meets Porter, her new enemy, basically. And throughout the summer, Bailey is torn between her love-hate relationship with Porter and this fantasy that she has online with Alex. But little does she know that they are the same person. And that's not a spoiler because it actually says it right on the back of the book. It's like the last sentence. I gave this book 5 stars, which I didn't think I was going to do, since I thought it was kind of weird that it seemed like such a big plot twist was just kind of given away by the end of the synopsis. But I actually still found myself holding my breath for the moment that they realized who the other person was. And enemy to lovers is probably my favorite kind of story, which is why I first decided to pick up this book. At first, I thought Porter was kind of mean, but once I started to see their chemistry and that started to become noticeable, it was really all I could focus on in their interactions, which kind of saved the story for me, and I honestly really liked their relationship and how they progressed. So the last book I've read during quarantine so far is Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. That kind of rhymes. And this follows Selena, who is an assassin that is summoned to the castle to become the king's champion. But it's not as easy as it sounds, because first she needs to defeat 23 men who are killers, thieves, and warriors. And they all go through these trials, and it's basically a competition to see who's the most fit to serve as the king's champion. So if Selena wins, she will serve the king for a few years and she will gain her freedom. But if she loses, she will just be sent right back to her prison. And while Selena is at the castle, she finds herself in the middle of a love triangle between a prince and the captain of the guard, who's there to protect her. And on top of the competition, there's also this unknown evil that she ends up having to battle, because all of her competitors start dying and nobody really knows why it's happening. I only gave this book 3.5 out of 5 stars. Although Selena is an assassin, I felt like the book didn't really have as many battle scenes as I thought. You know, since she's an assassin, I really thought it would be filled with so many like battle scenes and fights and all this stuff, and there weren't as many as I thought there would be, so that kind of left it lacking for me. And I knew that there was going to be a love triangle, and I'm kind of a sucker for love triangles, but I felt that since this is only the first book in a pretty long series, I thought that some of the characters' feelings kind of progressed a little quickly. So overall, I'm not really sure what was lacking from this book for me. It could have been just because it took me a while to read because I was really busy. So maybe I wasn't able to kind of dive in and be as invested as I could have been. But it was definitely enthralling enough for me to want to continue the series and to give this world another chance, because I really think that this is a really unique concept and it sounds really cool. Those are all the books I've read so far during quarantine. I bought a lot more though because I have no self-control. So if you want to see where all of my money has gone to during quarantine, I will put a link in the description to my quarantine summer book haul. But for now, please give this video a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. I'd really appreciate it. And also make sure you turn the bell on so you can get some notifications, because right now I have no upload schedule. So that'll kind of be the only way you'll know when a video comes out. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in my next video.